in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. This is Buck Joffrey, and today I'm going to talk to you about a topic I think is really interesting. It may not necessarily relate specifically to like longevity per se, but it's something in life in general that I think is an interesting concept to think about, and that is the science of human attraction, okay? So I have to tell you that I am a former cosmetic surgeon. Yeah, I know. I started out in neurosurgery, then did head and neck surgery, and I ended up doing cosmetic fellowship. Long story, but this is an area that I was in, so it is kind of fascinating to me. And it's a question that's been fascinating poets and artists and philosophers for centuries. I mean, it's an area now, believe it or not, of intense scientific study in multiple fields like biology, psychology, neuroscience, and more. And I am covering it basically because it's an interesting topic. And like I said, as a former cosmetic surgeon, I kind of have my own theories on stuff and having dealt with this stuff at a granular level. But at any rate, I think it's worth talking about, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. Attraction, obviously, has a profound force. It's a profound force that drives some of the most fundamental human behaviors, our animalistic behaviors, like mate selection and relationship formation, and our desire for intimate connection. What the science shows is there are, believe it or not, there's some universal principles, but there's obviously also complex interaction between many different variables, nuanced cocktail, if you will, that really is unique to individuals' preferences and experiences as well. I'm going to start with visual attraction, specifically facial visual attraction. If we get into body stuff, that's a completely different animal altogether, as you can imagine. But let's start with the idea or the concept of attraction by looking at the most rapid and almost instantaneous judgments our brains make. When you look at somebody and you look at their physical appearance and their facial features, what's interesting is research suggests that it takes about 0.2 seconds, that's 1/5 of a second, of visual contact for our brain to start forming impressions of attraction, right? That split-second process that's actually been confirmed through experiments and, seriously sophisticated stuff like functional MRI scans and, other brain imaging techniques. So no one's just guessing that, right? But there was a study from Harvard and the University of Leuven that was published in the Journal of Nonverbal Behavior that used an eye tracking device to monitor the precise eye movements of participants as they viewed a series of faces on computer screens. Those results were pretty remarkable. So within 13 milliseconds, that's less than blink of an eye, the participants' gaze, they could tell that the faces they were subconsciously perceiving as more attractive. And the way they did that is those people that were perceived as more attractive, those people that were looking at them, it was quite literally difficult for them to resist being drawn to their attractive faces, even when they were instructed to look somewhere else. I got to tell you, I kind of love how relatable these studies are. How many times have you maybe you've been with a significant other, someone you love, and that you'd never consider cheating or anything like that, but suddenly notice someone really attractive walk into a room or something like that, and you couldn't stop looking. It is actually physically challenging not to look. I think that's an interesting idea to have actually studied. But of course, our learned behavior is that we have to stop looking because first, the person you're with is not going to like it. They're going to get upset. And second, maybe more importantly, if you keep staring for somebody for longer than 3.3 seconds, the other person starts to feel uncomfortable and uneasy, okay? So remember that. Try to keep it under 3 seconds if you're going to stare at somebody. And that is unless there's mutual eye contact of perceived interest. In other words, if somebody's looking back at you, this suggests there's sort of this narrow window of just over 3 seconds of making those rapid visceral judgments of attraction on both sides before, the gaze either connects or it becomes off-putting. So if you don't get a positive response in 3 seconds, look away or you're going to look like a stalker. Now, on the other hand, if two people do engage in this continuous uninterrupted mutual eye contact that extends beyond a minute, something fascinating can happen. Research published in the journal PLOS 1 in 2017 explored this phenomena. In that study, participants were specifically instructed to gaze into the eyes of a stranger for an extended period of 60 to 90 seconds. And what they reported was that these people would feel increased feelings of emotional closeness and intimacy, even though they were with a stranger. Some even described that sort of as a quasi-spiritual experience of oneness and interconnectedness. So in that study, the researchers theorized that this type of effect taps into the same neural pathways and oxytocin release that allows mothers to bond with their infants through sustained eye contact and gaze. So it kind of creates this profound sense of connection that can at least temporarily dissolve the boundaries between self and others. So perhaps a dating hack. I'm no expert on this, but if you try to extrapolate something like this, so perhaps a dating hack might be to suggest, hey, how about we have a staring contest, with your first date or something like that. Just a thought. On the other hand, if you're one of those people, I would say, who doesn't make eye contact when you speak, fix that problem before your next date, because obviously eye contact seems to be a big one. If you can have sustained eye contact with somebody, you're much more likely to connect with them if that's what you want to do. But anyway, this eye contact thing, it aligns with the famous overview effect that some astronauts actually have described experiencing when viewing Earth from space. It's a cognitive shift in awareness that allows sort of them to transcend their individual identity and feel a heightened sense of unity with the entire planet and humanity as a whole. So, bottom line is, while those first impressions of attraction are formed rapidly based on facial cues, sustained eye contact seems to be the key catalyst for building deeper emotional resonance and intimacy over time, and it can also make you look like a stalker if it's unreciprocated. But let's go back to those initial moments there. That's really that sort of instinctual or visceral response. What specific visual traits are we actually picking up on during those split-second judgments? Well, research is done by evolutionary psychologists because really it's about mate selection, right? Like people are trying to figure out what kinds of things are making people want to reproduce with others. So evolutionary psychologists believe we are subconsciously attuned to signs of genetic fitness, health, and fertility. And that's not surprising, right? And that's what we potentially perceive as someone's attractiveness through facial features and physical appearance. So research has consistently shown across cultures that there are some common things that people really cue in on. And those are facial symmetry. And we're going to get into all these in more detail, but the next one is averageness of features. The next one is clear and unblemished skin. For women, high cheekbone prominence, and traditionally for men, more masculine features like a strong jawline and brow ridge. Those all tend to be universally perceived as more attractive. So anecdotally, as a guy who did a lot of, again, facial plastic cosmetic surgery, I can tell you that one of the biggest perceived elements of beauty is no doubt facial symmetry. And that's not surprising to me that that's what these studies show as well. Why? Well, a symmetrical face is thought to indicate greater genetic fitness because fluctuating asymmetry can arise from, developmental instabilities, genetic mutations. Multiple studies have shown that even very subtle deviations from perfect bilateral symmetry can actually reduce the perception of attractiveness ratings. Think about it as asymmetry as being sort of a sign that maybe, there's not infections or problems with genetics and that kind of thing. And that's what people are picking up on. And instinctually, that becomes attraction. For example, there's a study published in the Journal of Evolution and Human Behavior in 2008 that found that introducing even slight asymmetries to face images, what they were doing is moving features like the eyes or the mouth slightly off center, just by a few millimeters. When they did that, that led to decreased attractiveness scores compared to the original symmetric versions. So that's, again, just supporting this idea of symmetry. What's interesting is that's cross-cultural. The effect held true across European, Asian, African, pretty much across the board, all these different cultural, different types of faces. And so basically suggesting, again, facial symmetry preferences are universal. In another clever study from the University of Toronto, published in 2008, they had participants rate the attractiveness of hundreds of faces that were, in this case, digitally manipulated to be either more or less symmetrical along a vertical axis. And the results showed a very clear and strong preference for more symmetrical faces, consistently ranked as more attractive than their asymmetric counterparts. And again, this held true regardless of whether the original face was considered high or low in attractiveness to begin with. So it's just relative attractiveness gets more no matter what if you're more symmetric. That's what the science shows. So in other words, if you take your own face, superimpose one side on the other as a mirror image, in theory, you would be perceived as more attractive. Try it. Who knows? So in summary, symmetry seems to be an innate biological marker that our brains automatically associate with genetic fitness, health, and good developmental stability. And that's presumably why it is thought to be more attractive. Now, another attractiveness cue, as I mentioned earlier, is this concept of averageness or prototypicality of facial features. Now, what this means is that people tend to find facial features more attractive when they are not highly distinctive or exaggerated. In other words, the farther they get away from the mean, the less attractive their faces appear to be perceived by others. From an evolutionary perspective, you can think about this as a theory that exaggerated or less typical features might signal developmental disturbances, while average configurations or, more average facial features or whatever are theorized to represent a lack of quote unquote bad genes. Okay, so there's a study in 2014 in behavioral ecology that created composite faces by digitally averaging facial proportions and shapes across populations. And like you would expect from what I just said, the more average prototypical composites were consistently rated as more attractive across cultures. So, and then there was another study in 2014 in the journal Behavioral Ecology that explored how averageness of facial features influences attractiveness judgments. In that case, the researchers digitally combined facial images, again, to create composite faces with more or less average shapes, configurations, and proportions. And again, the results, based on what I just told you, not surprising, striking though, faces that were more average and closer to the population mean were consistently rated as more attractive across cultures, and those with more extreme distinctive features were considered less attractive. There's a common theme here in that researchers, again, propose that sort of the averageness of features is another biological sign that a potential mate's genes have been relatively free of mutations that could disrupt typical development. Again, these are the idea that people are, essentially trying to mate with other healthy people to propagate their own genes. And so they're looking for healthy mates. So anecdotally, when I think about the desire for averageness of facial features, certainly in facial cosmetic surgery, the most obvious example is rhinoplasty. I mean, people are looking for generally very, very much more average noses. Nobody comes in there. Very rarely would anybody come in and ask for, to put a dorsal hump or to, create a larger nose or something like that. They tend to want to be average. So again, not making any judgments here. Don't try to cancel me or anything, but that's what the science shows. Now, the next cue explains the multi-billion-dollar makeup industry and, frankly, the financial success of dermatologists around the world. Clear, unblemished skin has been cross-culturally associated with cues of health, fertility, and youth. All factors, again, tied to reproductive fitness. So there was a study in 2011, Frontiers of Psychology, that found that even subtle difference in skin quality, texture, and color significantly impacted attractiveness ratings for female faces across European, African, and Asian raters. So this is not like culturally specific. Clear skin is really, I guess, a major cue for attractiveness. And the association between clear and unblemished skin and perceptions of attractiveness, health, fertility, and youth, they can really be understood through, again, an evolutionary lens. We've talked about that before. Skin conditions serve as an important biological cue of overall health, genetic fitness, and reproductive potential in potential mates. So from an evolutionary perspective, preferences for mates with clear, smooth, evenly toned skin would have been adaptive for our ancestors and now good for the cosmetic industry. Again, blemishes, discolorations, skin abnormalities, they could indicate the presence of infectious disease or genetic disorders, poor nutrition, or even immunocompetence issues, all of which could potentially reduce fertility and reduce the chances of propagating your own genome. So again, we are animals. We have this idea in our head of what beauty is, but a lot of these things seem to be coming from deeper levels of our own brain that are effectively just looking for healthy people to mate with. The next thing to talk about a little bit is what are called sexual dimorphic traits. What are those, you may ask? Well, sexual dimorphic traits are basically just referring to these distinct, physical characteristics that typically differ between males and females of the same species. So they're like secondary sexual characteristics that are not directly involved in reproduction per se, but rather aid in attracting mates, like competing for mates or other behaviors related to mating and reproduction. So the preference for feminine facial features in women and masculine facial features in men, again, can be understood through this lens of evolutionary theory and sexual selection. So what are some of these key facial features that tend to be cross-culturally perceived as attractive? Well, in women, high cheekbone prominence is one. Defined high cheekbones are thought to arise from higher estrogen exposure during development. And a 2000 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that digitally enhancing cheekbone prominence in female faces increased attractiveness ratings by men across cultures again. So again, not just one culture thing. This is across the board. High cheekbones the thought is that, again, they may advertise high estrogen levels, and high estrogen levels may suggest greater fertility. Similarly, fuller lips are another sexually dimorphic trait more evident in female faces due to the effects of estrogen. 2011 study in the Journal of Perception showed that increasing lip fullness in female facial images enhance perception of attractiveness and also in health and femininity. So again, fuller lips may indicate higher estrogen levels and therefore fertility in effect. It's sort of crazy to think about these things in the context of the cosmetic industry, but all these things seem to be wired into us because of some evolutionary needs or preferences to propagate our own genes. Another one for women, and I was a little surprised about this one, but tend to have there seems to be a preference for slightly a more shorter or more delicate jawline and chin compared to men. Of course, I'm not exactly sure subjectively what that means, but a 2010 study in Vision Research found that by digitally reducing jaw size in female faces, basically that increased attractiveness perceptions in male raters across cultures. A smaller jaw is what's called neotness. Neotness is a fancy word for resembling youth. And so the idea may be that, if somebody has a slightly smaller jaw, they look young, and that is a sign of fertility and also the effects of female sexual hormones. Conversely, though, for men, key masculine facial features that enhance attractiveness include a prominent brow ridge, okay? This is a thought to arise from greater testosterone exposure during male facial development. A 2003 study in Evolution of Human Behavior found that enhancing brow ridge prominence in male faces increased perception of masculinity and attractiveness. Not surprisingly, a strong, wide jawline, just like you see in the cartoons. Men who tend to have a squarer, wider jawline tend to be perceived as more attractive. And again, the idea is that these types of secondary characteristics tend to be very much indicative of high testosterone levels. So a 2013 study in Evolution of Human Behavior showed that digitally enhancing jawlines, width, and height in male faces increase ratings, again, of masculinity and attractiveness. There's also this other variable that has been studied that's about overall facial robustness. So Masculine faces tend to have heavier brow ridges, wider cheekbones, and more robust overall skeletal facial structures. Those have been shown to be more attractive to women across cultures. And from an evolutionary perspective, feminine facial features like high cheekbones, full lips, and a small jaw in women may have evolved, again, as advertisements effectively of fertility and high estrogen levels. And the idea is that our ancestors who could accurately perceive or favor mates correctly in terms of their reproductive ability would be the ones who would be more likely to propagate their genes, and that's sort of the selective advantage. Another couple interesting studies that I found in 2005, there was a study in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, found that feminine female faces were rated as most attractive by men when fertility levels were highest during menstrual cycle. That is correct. So in other words, for whatever reason, when a woman is ovulating, she was perceived as most attractive by men, which of course, that if you're trying to reproduce, I mean, that's a great thing to notice, right? It's a great idea because that's when you're most likely to reproduce. And then in 2003, a study in Nature showed masculine male faces were perceived as most attractive for short-term sexual relationships, okay? Now, the idea there was likely due to associations with genetic fitness despite lower investment potential. In other words, I don't even need to do the in other words there for you. I'll say it again. A 2003 study in Nature showed masculine male faces were perceived as most attractive for short-term sexual relationships, likely due to the association with genetic fitness despite lower investment potential. Oh, my Lord. Okay, so that's a review of some of the science behind visual attractiveness, at least of the face. Now, the body, again, is a whole other can of worms for another day, which, I mean, holy cow. That'll be an interesting one. I don't know that much about that. I've mostly been a face guy throughout my life, so a lot of these concepts that I'm telling you about right now are familiar to me. Anyway, it's important to note that these evolutionary psychology findings represent general tendencies and patterns, and of course, they're not rigid rules. There's still plenty of diversity in individual preferences and what specific facial qualities or body types people find most attractive. Additionally, research has shown that when people are instructed to focus on other sensory inputs like smell, like while looking at someone, it can actually increase feelings of multisensory attraction and connection as well. So, for example, there was a study from the University of Rotterdam in 2011 that found that participants who were asked to vividly imagine the smell of their romantic partner while viewing photos of them actually experience increased activation in brain regions associated with feelings of attachment. So the author suggested that our sight and scent processing are deeply interlinked, which isn't surprising with the number of people wearing cologne and perfumes and things like that when it comes to attraction. And it's likely rooted in our ancestral need to, again, identify genetically compatible mates, which brings up, I think, an incredibly fascinating area, which is the smell and pheromones, right? You've probably heard of pheromones, right? So let's talk a little bit about the role of pheromones. So, visual cues, they provide those rapid instinctive judgments of attractiveness, but our sense of smell also plays this powerful role in shaping who we feel drawn to. And this is largely due to the existence of these things called pheromones, which are basically chemical signals released by our body that can influence physiology and behavior in others, including mate attraction. So what's interesting is that one key area of pheromone research is focused on something called major histocompatibility complexes, or MHCs. So these are groups of genes that code for proteins involved in the immune system's ability to recognize and fight off foreign invaders like viruses and bacteria. Now, what's interesting here, and this I find fascinating, is that numerous studies have actually shown that humans, as well as many other species, tend to be attracted to partners with different major histocompatibility complexes than their own. Like they want, well, I guess the theory is that they subconsciously, you're looking for a mate who can produce offspring with more genetically diverse and robust immune systems because, you got your own major histocompatibility complexes, and then you have your mates, and then you've got a kid who's got both and is therefore has a better immune system. And so the question is, how do we detect these immune differences that shape these attractions? And the answer is primarily through body odor and pheromones. Each person's unique body odor provides a chemical cues about their immune makeup and genetic compatibility. So in 1995, there was this landmark study in the journal Nature. Researchers from the University of Bern in Switzerland had women wear the same t-shirts for several nights to absorb their natural body odors. The researchers then had men smell these odor samples in a controlled experiment, and what the results found were striking. The men were consistently most attracted to the odors of women whose major histocompatibility complexes were different from their own. Even with no visual cues whatsoever, the men could subconsciously detect genetic incompatibility through smell alone. I'm not sure how you put that on a dating site, but there's also research showing that couples consistently rate their partner's scent as pleasant, even enjoyable, suggesting that there may be some kind of an innate biological component on how we detect pheromones and immune compatibility through smell. So, beyond the visual stuff, the initial sparks of attraction could actually be rooted in subconscious cues about genetic differences coming through your nose. Obviously, these studies, for the most part, are based on, heterosexual type attraction. But what's interesting is pheromones may also play a role in same-sex attraction as well. Though, of course, the research in this area is more limited. There was a study in 2005 from the University of Illinois that found that gay men rated the body odors of other gay men as more pleasant and attractive than the odors of heterosexual men. Again, this aligns with this theory that pheromones provide cues about genetic compatibility, which would be relevant for any sexually reproducing individuals, regardless of sexual orientation. Just a few other things on pheromones here. There are certain pheromone compounds that seem to have direct physiological effects on the body. For example, studies show that exposure to androstenedione, which is a pheromone found in male sweat, can actually elevate cortisol levels and physiological arousal in women and other men. And then there's another compound, estrotetrinol, which is derived from female urine, and that has been shown to promote sexual arousal and elevated mood in men exposed to it, even when they were not consciously aware of the exposure, which is kind of an interesting experiment, right? Anyway, so in many ways, pheromones could be considered as the sort of molecular foreplay that primes our bodies and brains for sexual attraction and receptivity, often operating entirely outside our conscious awareness, which, frankly, a lot of this stuff, does seem sort of out of our conscious awareness. We think we understand why we're attracted to people, but there seems to be something much more deeply rooted that has to do with genetic propagation. Anyway, that's probably a pretty good introduction for some of the basic concepts behind human attraction. Hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed kind of learning about it. That's it for me this week on Sapio with Buck Joffrey. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe. Until next time, this is Buck Joffrey for Sapio with Buck Joffrey.